The large metal doors of the Galactic Survival Academy slid open with a soft hiss. Danny Rodriguez stepped inside and looked around with wide eyes. The building was huge, bigger than any place he had ever seen. The walls were made of some kind of shiny metal that seemed to glow with its own light. Strange creatures from different worlds walked through the halls, talking in languages he could not understand. Danny was nervous. He had never been off Earth before, and now he was on Kepler Station, floating in space somewhere between the stars. He was here because his construction company had picked him to take a special test. If he passed, he could work on building projects on other planets. The pay would be amazing, enough to help his family back in Chicago. He walked down a long hallway, following signs that pointed to something called the Ice World Certification Exam. Other humans walked with him. There was Lisa Park, a woman who studied ocean life. She had short black hair and wore thick glasses. Next to her was Kevin Murphy, a man who knew about air and weather on different planets. He was tall and thin, and he kept checking some kind of computer device in his hand. Behind them was Amy Carter, a woman who studied rocks and ground. She carried a heavy bag full of tools and kept looking at the walls like she was trying to figure out what they were made of. They reached a big room with rows of seats. The room was cold, much colder than the hallway. Danny pulled his jacket tighter around himself. At the front of the room was a stage where a very strange creature stood waiting. The creature was tall, maybe 8 feet, and its body looked like it was made of clear crystal. Light seemed to move through its body in weird patterns. This was Professor ZLTSHAK. Professor Zelfik's voice filled the room when he spoke. It sounded like wind blowing through a cave, but somehow Danny could understand every word. "Welcome to the most difficult survival test in the galaxy," the professor said. "I am Professor Zelfik, and I have been teaching survival skills for over 200 years. Danny and the other humans found seats near the front. Around them sat other creatures from different worlds. There was a group of beings covered in thick fur that looked like giant cats. Another group had skin that looked like metal plates. Some creatures were so strange that Danny could not even guess what they were. Professor Zelfik began to speak again. "Today you will be tested on a planet we call Frost 7. This planet is covered in ice and snow. The temperature is always 40 degrees below zero. The wind blows at speeds that can knock you down and freeze you solid. Many have tried to survive on Frost 7, most have failed." The professor waved his hand, and the air above the stage filled with moving pictures. Danny could see a white planet covered in ice. The pictures showed terrible storms with snow flying everywhere. Then the pictures changed to show the bodies of creatures that had frozen to death. Danny felt his stomach turn. In the past 5 years, 67 different species have taken this test, Professor Zelfa continued. Only 12 have passed. The others died within the first few hours. He looked directly at the human group. Humans are particularly poorly suited for this challenge. Danny felt his face get hot with anger, but he kept quiet. Lisa Park shifted in her seat. Kevin Murphy stopped looking at his computer and stared at the professor. Amy Carter gripped her bag tighter. The professor continued his lecture. "Humans evolved on a warm planet. Your bodies have no fur to keep you warm. Your skin is thin and easily damaged by cold. You have no special organs to help you survive freezing temperatures. Other species have thick fat layers or can slow down their hearts to save energy. Humans have none of these things." More pictures appeared in the air. Danny saw the furry cat-like creatures from earlier. "The Betelgeusians have fur that is 3 inches thick," the professor explained. "They can survive in temperatures as low as 60 degrees below zero." But even they failed the Frost 7 test. They lasted only 4 hours before the cold killed them. The pictures changed to show the metal-skinned creatures. The Europans evolved on a moon covered in ice. Their metal skin can resist extreme cold. They have special blood that does not freeze. But they also failed Frost 7. They lasted 6 hours. Before they died, Danny looked around the room. The other humans looked scared. Some of the alien creatures were making worried sounds. Professor Zelphic seemed to enjoy scaring everyone. Now, let us talk about what makes Frost 7 so deadly, the professor said. The planet has very little atmosphere, so there is no protection from the cold of space. The wind never stops blowing. These winds carry ice crystals that can cut through skin. The ground is frozen so hard that it is like walking on steel. Danny thought about the winters in Chicago. His grandfather had always said that Chicago winters were tough, but they had nothing on real cold. His grandfather had told him stories about people who lived in places where it was always winter, places so cold that spit would freeze before it hit the ground. The test is simple, Professor Zelphic continued. You will be dropped on the surface of Frost 7. You will have no tools, no special equipment, no heated clothing. You must survive for 6 hours using only what you can find on the planet. If you're still alive when the ship returns, you pass the test. Kevin Murphy raised his hand. Professor, what exactly can we find on the planet to help us survive? Professor. Zelphic made a sound that might have been laughter. Ice, frozen dirt, and rocks, that is all. The planet has no plants, no animals, no shelter of any kind. It is a dead world covered in ice. Danny raised his hand. The professor looked at him with what seemed like amusement. Yes, human? What if we use the ice and snow to build something? Danny asked. The professor's crystal body seemed to brighten. Build something with ice and snow? No species has ever survived Frost 7 by building anything. The tools required to cut and shape ice would freeze and break in minutes. Even if you could somehow cut blocks of ice, you would freeze to death before you could build anything useful. Lisa Park leaned forward. Professor, humans have survived in cold places on Earth for thousands of years. We have ways of dealing with cold that other species might not know about. Impossible, Professor Zelphic said firmly. I have studied the survival abilities of over 300 species. I have tested the limits of biological adaptation to extreme cold. Humans are among the weakest species when it comes to cold survival. You have no natural protection against freezing temperatures, Amy Carter spoke up. But Professor, what about using teamwork, working together to stay warm? Teamwork will not help when the cold is killing you, the professor replied. Body heat is quickly lost in the conditions on Frost 7. Sharing warmth only means that everyone dies together instead of alone. Danny felt his anger growing. This crystal creature was talking like humans were weak and helpless. But Danny knew better. His grandfather had told him stories about the old days, when people had to survive in the wilderness with nothing but their hands and their brains. People had lived through ice ages and terrible winters long before there were heated buildings and warm clothes. Professor Zelphic looked around the room. I have arranged this test to be educational for all species. You will see what happens when a species tries to survive beyond its biological limits. The human failure will be instructive for others who might attempt similar challenges. The professor's words made Danny's hands close into fists. He was not going to let this alien creature use him as an example of human weakness. He thought about his grandfather's stories about the people who had lived in the Arctic for thousands of years. They had survived with nothing but ice and snow and their own knowledge. The transport ships will be ready in 1 hour, Professor, Zelphic announced. Use this time to prepare yourselves mentally for what is to come. Most of you will not survive, but your sacrifice will advance the cause of galactic survival science. As the other creatures began to leave the room, Danny stayed in his seat. Lisa, Kevin, and Amy gathered around him. They all looked worried. Danny, Lisa said quietly, maybe we should reconsider this. The professor seems to know what he's talking about. Danny shook his head. No, he doesn't. He thinks he knows everything about survival, but he doesn't know about humans. He doesn't know what we can do when we have to. Kevin looked doubtful. But Danny, the conditions sound impossible. 40 below zero with no shelter, no tools, nothing. Danny stood up and looked at his teammates. My grandfather always said that the difference between surviving and dying is not how strong you are, or how tough your skin is. It's about knowing what to do and doing it fast. I think I know what to do. The transport ship was smaller than Danny had expected. It looked like a metal box with engines attached to the sides. Inside, there were 20 seats bolted to the floor. The walls were covered with screens that showed information about the planet they were going to visit. Danny sat next to Lisa Park, who was reading something on a small computer. Kevin Murphy sat across from them, checking his weather equipment. Amy Carter was looking out the small window at the stars. Other creatures filled the remaining seats. The furry cat-like Betelgeusians sat together, making soft growling sounds to each other. The metal-skinned Europans sat very still, like statues. There were also some new creatures that Danny had not seen before. One group looked like giant insects with hard shells. Another group had skin that changed colors like a rainbow. Professor Zelfik's voice came through speakers in the ceiling. "We are now approaching Frost 7. The journey will take 2 hours. I will use this time to explain exactly why most of you will die." Danny felt his stomach drop as the ship began to move. He had never been in space before, and the feeling of floating made him sick. Lisa noticed his discomfort and handed him a small bag. "In case you need to throw up," she whispered. "Space travel affects everyone differently." Professor Zelfik continued talking through the speakers. "Frost 7 is what we call a death world. The surface temperature is negative 40 degrees Celsius. For those who use the old Earth system, that is negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Interestingly, negative 40 is the same in both systems." Danny tried to focus on the professor's words instead of his sick stomach. Negative 40 degrees was colder than anything he had ever experienced. The coldest day in Chicago he could remember was maybe negative 10 degrees, and that had been terrible. "The wind on Frost 7 never stops," the professor went on. "Average wind speed is 100 kilometers per hour. That is about 60 miles per hour in old Earth measurements. These winds carry ice particles that will cut exposed skin like tiny knives. The combination of wind and cold creates something called wind chill. The effective temperature your body feels will be negative 70 degrees Celsius." Kevin Murphy looked up from his equipment. "Professor, what about the atmosphere? Can we breathe the air?" "Yes, the air is breathable," Professor Zelfik replied. "But breathing air that cold will rapidly cool your internal body temperature. Each breath you take will steal heat from your lungs and heart. Most species begin to lose consciousness from this effect within 30 minutes. Danny thought about his grandfather again. The old man had worked construction in Chicago for 50 years. He had told Danny stories about working outside in winter, how to keep warm when the temperature dropped below zero. But negative 40 was something else entirely. Lisa was reading medical information on her computer. According to this, human body temperature is normally 37 degrees Celsius. If our core temperature drops by just 3 degrees, we start to lose control of our muscles. If it drops by 5 degrees, we start to think slowly and make bad decisions. If it drops by 10 degrees, we die. Amy Carter was studying geological data about Frost 7. The surface is mostly ice over rock. The ice layer is about 3 meters thick in most places. The ice is very hard because it has been compressed for thousands of years. It would be like trying to dig through concrete. Danny looked out the window and saw Frost 7 getting bigger. It was completely white, like a giant snowball floating in space. There were no brown or green areas anywhere. No signs of life, no cities, nothing but endless white. "The gravity on Frost 7 is slightly less than Earth normal," Professor Zelfik continued. "This might seem helpful, but it actually makes survival harder. Your muscles will work differently, and you will move in ways that waste energy. Energy conservation is critical for survival in extreme cold." One of the insect-like creatures made a clicking sound. Professor Zelfik seemed to understand and responded. "No, there are no caves or natural shelters on Frost 7. The planet's surface is completely flat ice plains. There are no mountains. No valleys, no trees, no rocks large enough to hide behind. You will be completely exposed to the wind and cold." Danny's grandfather had always said that the key to surviving winter was staying dry and staying out of the wind. If there was no natural shelter from the wind, you had to make your own. But how could you make shelter out of ice and snow with no tools? The ship began to shake as it entered Frost 7's atmosphere. Danny gripped his seat and tried not to throw up. Through the window, he could see storms swirling across the planet's surface. The snow was flying so fast and thick that it looked like fog. "We are now entering the atmosphere," Professor Zelthick announced. "Notice the storm systems. These storms never end. The wind patterns create what humans call a blizzard condition across the entire planet. Visibility is often less than 10 meters. Lisa looked scared. 10 meters? That's only about 30 feet. We won't be able to see anything." Kevin was taking readings with his instruments. "The atmospheric pressure is similar to Earth, but the temperature is dropping fast as we get closer to the surface. My equipment is showing negative 35 degrees outside the ship, and we're still 5 kilometers up." Amy was watching the ground approach. "I can see the surface now. It looks like an ocean of white. There are no landmarks, no way to tell where you are. If you got lost out there, you would never find your way back to the landing site." The ship touched down with a loud thud. Danny felt his heart beating fast. Through the small windows, he could see nothing but white. Snow was hitting the windows so hard it sounded like rocks being thrown at the ship. "Professor," Zelthick's voice filled the cabin one more time. "We have landed. The surface temperature is now negative 41 degrees Celsius. Wind speed is 110 kilometers per hour. The ship's doors will open in 5 minutes. You have 6 hours to prove your species can survive. The ship will return at exactly the same time to collect any survivors." Danny stood up and checked his clothes. He was wearing normal work clothes, jeans, a t-shirt, a heavy jacket, work boots, and gloves. It was the warmest clothing he owned. But he knew it would not be enough for negative 40 degrees. Lisa was shivering already, and they were still inside the heated ship. "My medical training says we should survive about 2 hours in these conditions. If we stay active. After that, hypothermia will make us too weak to move." Kevin was looking at his weather readings with disbelief. "These numbers are insane. I've studied extreme weather my whole career, and I've never seen conditions this bad." The wind chill factor puts the effective temperature at negative 73 degrees. Amy was checking her geological tools. "My equipment is already starting to malfunction from the cold. Metal becomes brittle at these temperatures. Tools can break just from being exposed to the air." The other creatures in the ship were making various sounds of fear and preparation. The Betelgeusians were fluffing up their fur. The Europans were checking connections between their metal skin plates. The insect creatures were huddling together. Danny closed his eyes and tried to remember everything his grandfather had taught him about cold weather survival. The old man had grown up during the Great Depression, when people had to survive with almost nothing. He had learned skills from Native American workers, men who knew how to live through the worst winters. "The secret," his grandfather had always sighed, "is not to fight the cold. You have to work with it. Ice and snow are not your enemies. They can be your friends if you know how to use them." A red light began flashing near the door. Professor Zelthick's voice announced, "Door opening in 30 seconds. Remember, you have no tools, no equipment, no artificial heat sources. You must survive using only what you find on the planet's surface. Many of you will die. This is expected and acceptable for the advancement of science." Danny felt anger rise up inside him again. This crystal creature expected them to die. He was probably taking bets on how long each species would last. Well, Danny was going to disappoint him. The door made a loud hissing sound and began to open. Immediately, the inside of the ship filled with freezing air. The cold hit Danny like a physical blow. It went right through his jacket and made his lungs hurt when he breathed, but as the door opened wider, Danny was looking for something specific. He was looking at the snow and ice on the ground, studying its color and texture. His grandfather had taught him that not all snow was the same. Some snow was good for building and some was not. "This might actually work," Danny said to himself, so quietly that nobody else could hear him over the howling wind. The moment Danny stepped off the ship, the cold hit him like a truck. The wind was so strong it almost knocked him over. Ice crystals flew through the air like tiny bullets, stinging his face and hands. He could barely see 10 feet in front of him because of all the blowing snow behind him. Lisa Park gasped and immediately started shaking. Her whole body was trembling, and her teeth were chattering so loud Danny could hear them over the wind. Kevin Murphy stumbled as he stepped onto the ice. His hands were already turning red, and he was having trouble holding his equipment. Amy Carter tried to use one of her tools to chip at the frozen ground, but the tool slipped from her numb fingers and clattered across the ice. The other alien creatures were not doing much better. The furry Betelgeusians were huddled together, but even their thick fur was not enough. Ice was forming on their whiskers and around their eyes. The metal-skinned Europans were making clanking sounds as their body plates contracted from the cold. Some of the insect creatures had already fallen over and were not moving. Danny forced himself to ignore the terrible cold and look around carefully. His grandfather had always told him that panic was the biggest killer in survival situations. You had to stay calm and think clearly, even when everything seemed hopeless. The ground under his feet was not just ice. It was compressed snow that had been packed down by wind over many years. Some areas were harder than others. Some areas had different textures. Danny knelt down and pressed his hand against the surface, even though the cold burned his skin. "This is good," he said to himself. The snow had the right consistency. It was not too soft and not too hard. It was packed tight enough to hold together, but not so hard that he could not cut it. His grandfather had taught him to test snow this way when they went ice fishing. Lisa Park was now shaking so badly she could barely stand. "Danny," she called out, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "I don't think I can last much longer. I can't feel my fingers anymore." Kevin Murphy had dropped his equipment and was trying to keep his hands warm by putting them under his arms. "The wind chill is incredible," he shouted. "We need to find shelter right now, or we're all going to freeze to death." Amy Carter had given up trying to use her tools. She was jumping up and down, trying to keep her blood moving, but Danny could see she was already getting clumsy. That was a bad sign. When people got too cold, they started losing control of their muscles. Danny looked around at the flat, white landscape. There was nothing, no rocks, no trees, no caves, no buildings, nothing but endless snow and ice in every direction. The ship that had brought them was already disappearing into the blowing snow as it took off to wait in orbit, but Danny was not looking for shelter that already existed. He was looking for materials to build shelter, and those materials were everywhere around him. "I need all of you to stay close to me," Danny shouted to his teammates. "Do exactly what I say and move when I tell you to move. We're going to build something." Lisa looked at him like he was crazy. "Build something? Out of what?" "There's nothing here but ice and snow." "That's exactly what we're going to use," Danny replied. He began walking in a small circle, studying the snow. He was looking for the perfect spot, a place where the snow was the right depth and consistency. Kevin Murphy shook his head. "Danny, that's impossible. We don't have any tools. We can't cut blocks of ice with our bare hands. We'll get frostbite in minutes." But Danny was already kneeling down and pushing his hands into the snow. The cold burned like fire, but he ignored it. He began pushing and shaping the snow, testing how it held together. His grandfather had taught him that the right kind of snow would stick to itself and get harder as you worked with it. "Watch me," Danny said to his teammates. "I'm going to show you something that people have been doing for thousands of years." He began cutting into the packed snow with his hands. The cold was terrible, but the work was also making his body produce heat. He had to keep moving, keep working. If he stopped, the cold would win. Danny cut out a block of snow about the size of a shoebox. The block held together perfectly. It was solid and strong, but not too heavy to lift. He set it aside and cut another block, then another. Amy Carter watched with amazement. "How are you doing that? The snow should just fall apart." "It's all about finding the right kind of snow," Danny explained as he worked. "This snow has been compressed by wind for a long time. It's got just enough moisture to stick together, but not so much that it's just solid ice. My grandfather called it building snow. Lisa was still shivering, but she was watching Danny work with scientific interest. The physical activity is keeping you warm. You're generating heat through muscle movement? Danny nodded as he cut more blocks. That's part of it. But there's more. I'm not just building something random. I'm building something specific, something that will use the cold to help us instead of hurt us. Kevin Murphy looked confused. Use the cold to help us? How is that possible? Danny began laying the blocks in a circle. Each block fit against the others in a specific way. I'm building an igloo. It's a kind of house made completely out of snow and ice. The Inuit people used to build these in the Arctic. They could survive in temperatures much colder than this. Amy Carter knelt down to look at how Danny was placing the blocks. But how does a house made of ice keep you warm? Ice is cold. That's the genius of it, Danny said, continuing to work. Ice is actually a great insulator when you use it right. The igloo will trap our body heat inside and keep the wind out. The shape is important too. A dome is the strongest shape, and it makes the warm air circulate properly. Professor Zelfik's voice crackled through a communication device that had been left near the landing site. He was watching from his ship in orbit. Human Rodriguez, explain what you are attempting. My sensors show you are manipulating the frozen precipitation, but I do not understand the purpose. Danny did not stop working as he answered. I'm building shelter, Professor. Humans have been doing this for thousands of years in places just as cold as this planet. Impossible, came the professor's reply. No species can construct functional shelter from environmental ice without proper tools and heating equipment. You will exhaust yourself and freeze to death even faster. But Danny was not exhausting himself. The work was hard, but it was also keeping him warm. Each block he cut and placed generated heat in his muscles. His hands were cold, but they were still working. His body was finding a rhythm. Lisa, Kevin, and Amy huddled closer to Danny as he worked. They were still cold, but being near someone who was moving and generating heat helped a little. I need you all to help me, Danny said. Lisa, start gathering. Loose snow to fill the gaps between blocks. Kevin, we need to make a tunnel entrance that will keep the cold air from getting inside. Amy, help me cut more blocks. They began working together. Lisa used her hands to pack snow into the cracks between Danny's blocks. Kevin began digging a low tunnel at the base of the growing dome. Amy watched how Danny cut blocks and started. Cutting her own, the work was painful because of the cold, but it was also hopeful. For the first time since stepping off the ship, they were doing something that might actually save their lives. As they worked, the structure began to take shape. It looked like a giant bowl turned upside down. The blocks spiraled upward, each row leaning in slightly more than the row below it. Danny placed each block with care, making sure it fit perfectly with the others. Other creatures on the planet were not doing as well. In the distance, Danny could see some of the alien species lying motionless in the snow. The cold was winning against them. But here, in this small circle of activity, humans were fighting back. How much time do we have? Amy asked as she struggled to cut another block. Kevin checked his watch, though his hands were shaking badly. We've been on the surface for 45 minutes. The ship comes back in 5 hours and 15 minutes. Danny looked up at the dome he was building. It was about half finished. We're going to make it, he said. Just keep working. Keep moving. Don't let the cold stop you. The wind howled around them and the snow kept falling, but Danny and his teammates kept building. Block by block, they were creating something that had never existed on Frost 7 before. They were creating hope. Danny's hands were so cold they felt like they were on fire, but he did not stop working. He had built igloos with his grandfather many times on Lake Michigan, but never in conditions this bad. The wind on Frost 7 was much stronger than anything he had experienced on Earth. The snow was harder too. But the basic idea was the same. He cut another block of compressed snow and lifted it carefully. Each block had to be exactly the right size and shape. Too big, and it would not fit properly. Too small, and the dome would be weak. Danny's grandfather had taught him to measure blocks using his own body. Each block should be about as long as his forearm and as wide as his hand. Lisa, pack more snow in that gap, Danny called out. His voice was getting hoarse from shouting over the wind. Lisa Park was moving slowly now, her fingers clumsy from the cold, but she was still helping. She gathered loose snow in her numb hands and pressed it between the blocks where Danny pointed. Kevin Murphy was working on the entrance tunnel. The tunnel had to be lower than the floor of the igloo, so cold air would sink into it instead of rising into the living space. Danny's grandfather had explained this to him years ago. Cold air is heavy, so it falls down. Warm air is light, so it rises up. The tunnel would trap the cold air and keep the warm air inside the dome. Kevin, make the tunnel about 3 feet long, Danny instructed, and keep it low. You should have to crawl to get through it. Amy Carter was getting better at cutting blocks. At first, her blocks had been crooked and uneven. Now she was learning to read the snow to see where the natural breaking points were. Danny, this snow is amazing, she said through chattering teeth. It's like natural concrete. The more we work with it, the harder it gets. Danny nodded as he placed another block. That's exactly right. The pressure from our hands and the cold air makes the snow compress even more. In a few hours, this dome will be stronger than when we built it. High above them in his orbiting ship, Professor Zelthick was watching through powerful sensors. He had never seen anything like what the humans were doing. His instruments showed that Danny's core body temperature had actually stabilized. The other 3 humans were still dangerously cold, but they were not getting worse as fast as his calculations predicted. Human Rodriguez, the professor's voice crackled through the communication device. My sensors indicate you have been working for over an hour. You should be unconscious from hypothermia by now. Explain how this is possible. Danny did not look up from his work. Exercise, Professor. Moving your muscles creates heat. As long as I keep working, I stay warm enough to keep working. But the energy expenditure should exhaust you quickly in these conditions, Professor Zelthick protested. You are burning calories at an accelerated rate. You will collapse from fatigue. Maybe, Danny replied, fitting another block into place. But I'll have shelter before that happens. The igloo was now more than halfway complete. The dome was taking its final shape, curving inward toward the top. Each new row of blocks leaned in a little more than the row below it. Danny had to be very careful now. If he made a mistake, the whole thing could collapse. Lisa Park was studying the structure with scientific fascination, even though she was shivering badly. The engineering is brilliant, she observed. Each block supports the others. The weight is distributed evenly around the entire circle. Amy Carter was examining the joints between blocks. Look how the snow is freezing together. The blocks are becoming one solid piece. It's like the cold is welding them together. Kevin Murphy finished the entrance tunnel and crawled out, brushing snow off his clothes. The tunnel is done. It goes down about 2 feet and then curves up into the dome. Cold air should get trapped in the low part. Danny checked Kevin's work and nodded approval. Perfect. Now we need to finish the top before we lose our strength. The top of an igloo was the hardest part. Each block had to be cut to fit the curved space exactly. There was no room for mistakes. Danny's grandfather had always said that the top few rows separated the amateurs from the experts. Danny climbed up on the partially finished dome to place the higher blocks. The wind was even stronger up there, and the cold seemed to bite deeper. But he was so close to finishing that he could not stop now. Hand me the next block, he called down to Amy. She lifted a block up to him. Danny examined it carefully then, used his hands to shape it slightly before putting it in place. The block fit perfectly against its neighbors. Professor Zelthick's voice came through the communicator again. The structural engineering you are displaying is remarkable. My analysis shows that your construction technique is distributing stress loads with mathematical precision. How is this possible without computational tools? Danny smiled grimly as he placed another block. My grandfather learned this from people who had been doing it for thousands of years. They did not need computers. They had something better. What could be better than advanced calculation systems? The professor asked. Experience, Danny replied. Knowledge passed down from father to son, from teacher to student. Trial and error over generations. You learn what works and what does not work. Lisa Park was watching Danny work from below. Even though she was cold and scared, she was amazed by what she was seeing. It's like watching someone perform surgery, she said to Kevin and Amy. Every movement has a purpose. He knows exactly what he's doing. Kevin Murphy was checking his watch. We've been out here for 2 hours. According to my medical knowledge, we should all be unconscious by now. Amy Carter looked at her own hands. They were red and numb, but she could still move her fingers. Working together is keeping us warmer. Sharing body heat, helping each other, it's making a difference. Danny was now working on the very top of the dome, only a few more blocks to go. Each block had to be cut smaller than the ones below it. The final block, called the keystone, would lock everything together. This is the most important part, Danny called down to his teammates. The keystone has to fit exactly right or the whole dome could fall down. He cut the keystone block carefully, shaping it with his numb fingers until it was exactly the right size. Then he lowered it into the hole at the top of the dome. It fit perfectly, locking all the other blocks in place. It's done, Danny announced. We have shelter. Professor Zelthek's instruments were showing readings he could not believe. The humans had actually built a functional structure using only environmental materials and their bare hands. In conditions that should have killed them in the first hour, they had created something that might actually keep them alive. The internal temperature of your structure is already rising, the professor reported. My thermal sensors show it is 15 degrees warmer inside the dome than outside. Danny climbed down from the igloo and looked at his teammates. They were all exhausted and cold, but they were still conscious and moving. Time to get inside, he said. Lisa Park looked at the small tunnel entrance. We have to crawl through that. It's the only way, Danny explained. The small entrance keeps the heat from escaping. Warm air rises, so it stays trapped in the dome. Cold air sinks, so it gets trapped in the tunnel. Kevin Murphy got down on his hands and knees and crawled through the tunnel first. Oh my God. His voice came from inside the dome. It's so much warmer in here, I can actually feel my fingers again. Amy Carter went next, then Lisa Park. Finally, Danny crawled through the tunnel he had helped design. The difference was immediate and amazing. The howling wind became a whisper. The stinging ice crystals could not reach them. Most importantly, the terrible cold that had been trying to kill them was held back by walls of snow and ice. Inside the dome, the 4 humans sat in a circle, breathing hard from their work. Steam rose from their bodies as they warmed up. For the first time since leaving the ship, they were not fighting for their lives against the cold. We did it, Lisa said, her voice full of wonder. We actually built a house out of snow and ice. And it's keeping us warm. Danny leaned back against the curved wall of the igloo. My grandfather would be proud, he said softly. He always said that humans don't survive by being the strongest or the toughest. We survive by being smart. Outside, the wind continued to howl and the snow continued to fall. But inside their igloo, 4 humans had turned the deadliest planet in the galaxy into a temporary home. Inside the igloo, Danny Rodriguez sat with his back against the curved wall and finally allowed himself to relax. His hands were still cold, but they were not numb anymore. His face had stopped hurting from the wind and ice. For the first time since stepping off the transport ship, he felt like he might actually survive this test. Lisa Park was examining her hands with amazement. I can move my fingers again, she said. 20 minutes ago, I thought I was going to lose them to frostbite. Kevin Murphy was checking the temperature with a small device he had managed to keep working. It's -5 degrees Celsius in here, he announced. That's 37 degrees warmer than outside. We went from deadly conditions to just very cold conditions. Amy Carter was running her hands along the walls of the igloo. The ice blocks are freezing together. They're becoming one solid piece. This structure is getting stronger every minute. Danny nodded. That's how igloos work. The cold that was trying to kill us is now helping us. The walls will keep getting harder and stronger as long as the temperature stays below freezing. Professor Zelthik's voice came through the communication device outside. Human team, respond please. My sensors show unusual thermal readings from your location. Danny crawled to the tunnel entrance and called back. We're all alive, Professor. We're inside our shelter, inside your shelter. The professor's voice sounded confused. Explain what you mean by shelter. We built a house out of snow and ice, Danny replied. An igloo. We're sitting inside it right now, and it's keeping us warm. There was a long silence from Professor Zelthik. Then his voice returned, sounding different than before. My thermal imaging shows 4 human life signs clustered together in what appears to be an enclosed space. But my visual sensors show only snow and ice in your location. That's because our house is made of snow and ice, Lisa called out. From the outside, it probably looks like just another snowdrift. Kevin added, Professor, the internal temperature in here is stabilizing at -5 degrees. Our body heat is warming the space, and the ice walls are holding that heat inside. Professor Zelthik was quiet for several minutes. Danny could imagine the crystal alien running calculations and checking his instruments over and over again. Finally, his voice returned. This should not be possible. No species in my database has ever successfully modified environmental conditions using only naturally occurring materials. Amy laughed, and the sound echoed strangely in the dome. Professor, humans have been modifying environmental conditions. For thousands of years, we call it technology. But this is not technology, Professor Zelthik protested. Technology requires manufactured tools, processed materials, energy sources. You have none of these things. Danny crawled back to the center of the igloo and sat down with his teammates. Professor, I think you don't understand what technology really means. Technology is not just machines and computers. Technology is using knowledge to solve problems. Lisa nodded in agreement. My grandfather was a doctor before modern medical equipment existed. He saved lives using basic tools and knowledge. That was technology too. Kevin pointed to the curved walls around them. This igloo is technology. It uses physics principles like compression, insulation, and heat transfer. It's just technology that's thousands of years old. Amy added, humans didn't wait for someone to invent heating systems and insulated buildings. We learned to survive first, then we invented better ways later. Professor Zelthik's voice sounded thoughtful now. You are suggesting that human survival capability is not based on biological adaptation, but on intellectual adaptation. Exactly, Danny replied. Other species evolved thick fur or special blood that doesn't freeze. Humans evolved big brains that can solve problems. Outside the igloo, the storm continued to rage. The wind was still howling at over 100 kilometers per hour. The temperature was still -40 degrees. Ice crystals were still flying through the air like tiny knives. But inside their small dome, 4 humans were not just surviving. They were comfortable. Lisa was studying the engineering of their shelter with scientific interest. The dome shape distributes the weight perfectly. No single point is under too much stress. That's why it doesn't collapse. Kevin was measuring the airflow. The entrance tunnel is working exactly like Danny said it would. Cold air sinks down into the tunnel and stays there. Warm air rises up into the dome and circulates around us. Amy was examining how the blocks fit together. Each block supports the others. If we tried to remove one block, we probably couldn't do it without breaking it. The whole structure is locked together. Danny was thinking about his grandfather again. The old man had taught him so many things that seemed simple but were actually very clever. My grandfather used to say that the best technology is invisible. You don't notice it because it works so well. Professor Zelthik's voice interrupted his thoughts. Human Rodriguez, how long did it take you to construct this shelter? Danny thought back to their frantic work in the freezing wind. About 2.5 hours from start to finish. 2.5 hours, the professor repeated slowly. You created functional architecture in 2.5 hours using only environmental materials and manual labor? That's right, Danny confirmed. And we did it while the environment was actively trying to kill us. There was another long silence from Professor Zelfik. When he spoke again, his voice sounded different, less arrogant, more curious. In my 200 years of studying survival capabilities, I have never seen anything like this. Most species either have biological adaptations for extreme environments or they require advanced technology to survive. Humans appear to have created a third option, Lisa spoke up. What do you mean, a third option? You have created intermediate technology, the professor explained. Technology that bridges the gap between biological capability and advanced manufacturing. You use knowledge and skill to transform environmental hazards into survival tools? Kevin was nodding with understanding. We didn't fight the environment. We didn't try to overcome it with superior strength or special biology. We worked with it. Amy added, we turned ice and snow from enemies into allies. The same materials that were freezing us to death became the materials that saved our lives. Danny leaned back against the wall and smiled. Professor, I think you've been testing species the wrong way. You've been looking for creatures that can survive extreme environments, but humans don't survive extreme environments. We changed them. Professor Zelfik was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, explain what you mean by change them. Right. Now, this spot on Frost 7 is not an extreme environment anymore, Danny said. Inside this igloo, the temperature is comfortable. The wind can't reach us. The ice crystals can't cut us. We took a piece of a deadly world and made it livable. Lisa was getting excited as she understood the implications. And we could do it again anywhere on this planet. If we had to, we could build a whole village of igloos. We could make Frost 7 habitable. Kevin was checking his watch. We still have 3 hours left before the ship returns. But we're not just surviving anymore, we're thriving. Amy looked around their small shelter with pride. We built a home on an alien world using nothing but our hands and our knowledge. Professor Zelfik's voice came through the communicator one more time, and now it sounded almost respectful. Humans, I believe I owe you an apology. I've spent 2 centuries studying how species adapt to environments. I never considered that. A species might adapt environments to themselves. Danny smiled and settled back against the wall of their igloo. Outside, Frost 7 remained one of the deadliest worlds in the galaxy. But inside their dome of ice and snow, 4 humans had proven that deadly was just another word for unconquered. Professor, Danny said, if you want to understand humans, here's the most important thing to remember. We don't just survive impossible things, we make impossible things look easy. The wind howled outside, but inside the igloo the humans were warm, safe, and proud. They had taken the worst that the galaxy could throw at them and turned it into a home.